At 8:44 a.m. on June 15, 1944, a Higgins boat slammed through the surf 300 yards off Saipan's southern beaches. Japanese artillery shells burst in the water ahead, throwing white spray across steel ramps and shaking the engine deck beneath crouched Marines. First Lieutenant Frank Tachsky, 29 years old, lean and tight-shouldered, hunched near the bow with a carbine pressed against his chest. He commanded 40 men packed behind him, everyone selected from brigs or punishment details, men the Marine Corps officially labeled problems. Their mission was not to seize ground or hold a beachhead, but to move alone into enemy territory and stay there for days. Intelligence estimated roughly 30,000 Japanese soldiers dug across the island ahead, backed by artillery tanks and underground defenses. This was the first American assault on land the Japanese considered part of Japan itself, and resistance would be absolute. Tachsky's scout sniper platoon had trained for 6 months in Hawaii, but this was their first combat, and Pacific casualty averages for units like theirs ran near 73%. If they failed to see what waited beyond the jungle, entire battalions would walk blind into prepared kill zones. There would be no support once they moved inland, no rescue if captured, and no margin for hesitation. The ramp dropped. Cold water surged into the boat as machine gun fire stitched the surf, and men surged forward into chest-deep waves. 3 minutes later, they hit the sand, and Tachsky did not slow. By 9:30 a.m., his platoon had pushed 300 yards inland, farther than any other Marine unit on that beach. They were already alone. Ahead lay Jungle Ridge's tunnels, and an enemy army waking up to invasion. Night would fall in 9 hours, and when it did, their real work would begin. Who survives when no one is expendable? The island of Saipan sat at the center of a widening war map. In the summer of 1944, small in size, but enormous in consequence. From the air, Saipan looked manageable, roughly 14 miles long, 5 miles wide, ringed by beaches that seemed made for landings. On paper, it was just another objective in the Mariana Islands campaign. In reality, Saipan was the first place the United States would invade, that Japan considered part of its own homeland. What happened here would echo far beyond this island. For American planners, Saipan was the key that unlocked the Western Pacific. From airfields on this island, heavy bombers could finally reach the Japanese home islands on a regular basis. If Saipan fell, the strategic balance of the war would tilt decisively. For Japan, Saipan was a line that could not be allowed to break. Losing it would expose Tokyo, Osaka, and industrial centers that had never before faced sustained aerial attack. The Imperial Command understood this, and they prepared accordingly. Japanese forces on Saipan numbered roughly 30,000 Imperial Army and Navy troops, reinforced by thousands of armed civilians. They were not spread thin or waiting on beaches. They were dug in layered deep and prepared to fight until they were lost. At the island's center rose Mount Tapochau, more than 1,500 feet high, a natural observation tower. From its slopes, Japanese observers could see nearly every approach route, every beachhead, every inland valley the Marines would have to cross. The terrain worked against the attackers at every level. Dense jungle limited visibility to a few yards in places. Limestone ridges hid caves and tunnels that could swallow entire gun crews. Every valley and beach had been registered for artillery and mortar fire long before the first Higgins boat touched sand. Japanese doctrine on Saipan was simple and unforgiving. Allow the Americans to land, then bleed them slowly from concealed positions with interlocking fields of fire and counterattacks timed for darkness. Marine planners knew the numbers would be grim. Casualty estimates for the opening phases ran as high as 50%. In the Pacific Scout sniper units already averaged losses near 73% over the course of a campaign. On the ground, that meant Marines moving forward with the knowledge that many of them would not come back. It meant men sleeping in shallow foxholes under constant shell fire, barely able to dig into coral-hard soil. It meant wounded being treated in the open under canvas while the ground shook from naval gunfire overhead. Every American advance inland depended on information. Where were the machine guns that covered the valleys? Which ridges hid mortars? Which paths would funnel entire companies into prepared kill zones? Standard infantry assaults could take a ridge at enormous cost, only to discover another line of defenses behind it. Naval gunfire and artillery were powerful but blind without precise coordinates. That was where Tachsky's platoon fit into the larger picture. The scout snipers were not meant to fight battles in the traditional sense. They were meant to see first, to map what no one else could see, and to vanish before the enemy understood what was happening. If they succeeded, Marine regiments could advance behind walls of accurate fire, breaking Japanese defenses faster and with fewer losses. If they failed, entire battalions would move forward without eyes into terrain designed to destroy them. By mid-morning on June 15th, the landing beaches were already choked with wounded and wreckage. Japanese resistance had not broken. It had only begun to unfold. Somewhere ahead beyond the first ridges and into the jungle, the real battle for Saipan was waiting, and a single thin platoon was about to walk straight into it. If they missed one position, who would pay the price? First Lieutenant Frank Tachsky did not look like the kind of officer the Marine Corps usually put at the edge of a knife. He was not loud, not theatrical, and not interested in speeches. At 29, lean and compact, he carried himself with the quiet economy of someone who expected trouble and planned to survive it. Other officers saw his assignment as a problem detail. Tachsky saw it as an opportunity. The 40 men under his command were not model Marines. They came from brigs and punishment details across the 2nd Marine Division. Many had disciplinary records for fighting theft or disobedience. Some had criminal histories long before they ever put on a uniform. To the Marine Corps bureaucracy, they were liabilities. To Tachsky, they were proof of something else. His recruiting rule was brutally simple. When 2 Marines got into a fight, the one who walked to the brig had demonstrated endurance, aggression, and refusal to quit. That was the man Tachsky wanted. Over 2 months of selection and training, he assembled men ranging in age from 17 to 34. One had been a professional boxer. Another had worked as a bodyguard for a Chicago gangster. Several had grown up fighting just to stay fed. They were given a choice: military prison or combat duty so dangerous few volunteers would take it. Every man chose combat. Their training was unlike anything taught to regular infantry. They learned silent killing with knives and bare hands, how to approach a sentry without disturbing leaves or branches. They practiced jungle movement until they could pass through dense vegetation without leaving a trace. Marksmanship standards were unforgiving. With M1903 Springfield rifles and high-power scopes, they trained to hit man-sized targets from 600 yards. They learned to use bazookas not as last-ditch weapons, but as tools for precision destruction. Just as important, they learned independence. Standard Marine doctrine emphasized formations, radio discipline, and obedience to orders from above. Tachsky taught his men something different. Think for yourself. Make decisions fast. If communication fails, act anyway. Years later, survivors would remember one belief he repeated during training. Plans and equipment mattered, but survival belonged to the man who could adapt faster than the enemy. By June 1944, Tachsky understood exactly what he was asking of them. He was taking men no one trusted and sending them where no one else could go. Every decision they made would be final and often invisible to history. He also knew something else. If this experiment failed, the blame would land squarely on him. And the cost would not be measured only in reports and maps. It would be measured in names. By mid-morning on June 15th, Frank Tachsky led his platoon away from the noise of the beaches and into the thick interior of Saipan. They moved fast, spreading out 50 yards apart using hand signals instead of radios. Standard Marine units advanced in tight formations. Tachsky's men dissolved into the jungle. By 9:30 a.m., they had already pushed 300 yards inland. No other Marine unit was that far forward. They were operating completely alone. The jungle swallowed sound and distance. Every step revealed new ground, new shadows, new places an enemy could hide. Mini Scene 1. First contact. At 10:15 a.m., Sergeant Bill Canopel froze and raised a clenched fist. Ahead, built into a ridgeline, sat a Japanese concrete pillbox, invisible from the beaches below. A Type 92 heavy machine gun covered the entire valley, its interlocking fire lanes aimed exactly where Marine units would advance later that day. 7 Japanese crewmen manned the position. Tachsky's map showed 3 possible Marine routes through the valley. The machine gun covered all 3. If the platoon bypassed the pillbox, dozens of Marines would be lost later. If they attacked it, their presence would be revealed. Tachsky gave himself 30 seconds. Mini-scene 2, breaking the rules. Private Marvin Strombo crawled into position 80 yards from the pillbox bazooka balanced on a fallen log. The rest of the platoon melted into security positions. At 10:32 a.m., Strombo fired one rocket. The round punched through the firing slit and detonated inside. The Japanese crew was lost instantly. Before the smoke cleared, the platoon was already moving. They left nothing behind but silence and a shattered bunker. Mini-scene 3, mapping the island. By noon, the platoon had identified 17 enemy positions, 8 machine gun nests, 4 mortar pits, 3 artillery observation posts, 2 ammunition storage areas. Tachsky transmitted encoded coordinates back to regimental headquarters. Within 20 minutes, destroyers offshore began firing 5-inch shells. From concealed jungle positions, the platoon watched fortifications disappear that had existed minutes earlier. This was how Saipan would be taken, or so it seemed. Mini-scene 4, the discovery. At 3:40 p.m., the jungle opened into a grove north of Chiran Kanoa. Under camouflage netting sat 37 Type 97 medium tanks. Marine intelligence had estimated perhaps a dozen Japanese tanks on the island. Here were 3 times that number staged together. Japanese doctrine favored night-armored assaults. If these tanks reached the beaches after dark supply dumps and artillery positions would be exposed, Tachsky radioed the coordinates immediately. The response came back 8 minutes later. No naval gunfire available. No air support. Artillery still unloading. 4 hours minimum. By then it would be night. Mini-scene 5, the almost assault. Tachsky looked at the tanks and then at his men. 6 bazookas, 6 rounds per launcher, 36 rockets, 37 tanks. The math was brutal. At 4:15 p.m., he ordered the platoon to prepare for an attack. If they struck now, they might cripple the battalion before it moved. Then the jungle changed. Mini-scene 6, engines in the dark. At 4:25 p.m., 37 diesel engines roared to life at once. Japanese crews climbed onto hulls. Officers shouted orders. Infantry began forming around the armor. This was not repositioning. This was an attack forming early. Tachsky checked his watch. Sunset was at 7:12 p.m. The window for surprise had closed. Mini-scene 7, shadowing the enemy. Tachsky canceled the assault. Instead, the platoon followed the tank battalion at a distance of 200 yards using jungle cover. Every 10 minutes, Tachsky transmitted updated coordinates. Along the beaches, Marine units began shifting. Bazookas moved forward. Sherman tanks rolled into position. Artillery adjusted fire plans. At 5:07 p.m., the Japanese force began moving toward the coast. 2 columns, 37 tanks, approximately 1,000 infantry. This was a full breakthrough attempt. Mini-scene 8, the turn. At 6:15 p.m., 1 mile from the beach, the Japanese halted. Tachsky observed through binoculars from 300 yards away. Officers argued. Maps were unfolded. Hands pointed north. 11 minutes later, the formation changed direction. They were not heading for the main beachhead. They were heading for the gap. Mini-scene 9, the real target. By 7:05 p.m., the plan was clear. The Japanese intended to split the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions. Only 2 Marine companies, about 340 men, defended that sector. Against 37 tanks. Against 1,000 infantry. Dusk fell as radios crackled and units scrambled. Time was running out. Mini-scene 10, the lone tank. At 7:23 p.m., the attack began. As Marine bazookas flared in the twilight, 1 Japanese tank broke away from the formation. It moved fast, following a ravine directly toward the 6th Marine Regiment command post. Inside that command post, senior officers coordinated the entire divisional defense. They were unaware of the threat. The tank was 400 yards away. Tachsky had 3 minutes. Mini-scene 11, the intercept. He grabbed Private Herbert Hages, the platoon's best bazooka gunner. They ran downhill through the dark, closing the distance. At 7:31 p.m., they reached a position 30 yards from the tank's projected path. The Type 97 emerged from the ravine turret, rotating. The commander stood exposed in the hatch. Hodges waited. 15 yards. Then the tank stopped. At 7:32 p.m., Hodges fired. The rocket struck the tank's left side beneath the turret ring. The shaped charge penetrated. The crew was lost instantly. 6 seconds later, the tank's ammunition ignited. The jungle lit up for 300 yards. Mini-Scene 12, The Cost of Light. Japanese infantry nearby assumed they had encountered a major Marine defensive position. They redirected their assault away from the command post. The regimental headquarters survived, but the muzzle flash had revealed everything. Machine gun fire swept the ridge. Mortars began falling. The platoon had seconds to move. Mini-Scene 13, Night Withdrawal. Under fire, the platoon split into small teams of 4 and 5. Standard doctrine said stay together. Survival said disappear. In the dark jungle, teams slipped past Japanese patrols by inches. Flashlights passed within 10 feet of hiding Marines. By 9:00 p.m., only 23 men reached the rally point. 17 were missing, dead, captured, or lost. No one knew which. Mini-Scene 14, Dawn Decisions. At first light on June 16th, Tachsky sent search teams back into the jungle. They found men who had been lost in the night. They found others who had been killed in action. Some were still alive, hiding in caves a mile behind enemy lines. Tachsky faced another choice. Artillery could help, or it could doom them. He chose speed. Mini-Scene 15, The Ravine. The rescue team moved in daylight. They ambushed a Japanese patrol in 7 seconds and kept moving. Then the ground dropped away. A 40-foot ravine. Near vertical sides, Japanese troops appeared on the ridge above. Bullets ricocheted off stone. Grenades burst among rocks. At 1:38 p.m., the ravine ended. A box canyon. No exit. Mini-Scene 16, The Fissure. While Japanese soldiers descended, Tachsky noticed water-fed vegetation along the canyon wall. 2 Marines pushed through the growth. A narrow fissure, barely wide enough. One by one, the team squeezed through, dragging equipment behind them. Inside, it was pitch dark. Behind them, Japanese voices echoed through the canyon. Mini-Scene 17, Escape. At 2:07 p.m., the passage opened onto the far side of the ridge. The enemy searched the wrong ground. The Marines ran. At 2:23 p.m., all 11 crossed back into friendly lines. They had vanished where the enemy expected bodies. The platoon would go out again. Deeper, riskier. Saipan was far from finished, and neither were they. How many times can a thin line hold? The jungle went strangely quiet after the tank exploded. Not silent, just different. The main Japanese assault continued toward the gap between divisions, but near the ravine, the enemy hesitated. Confusion spread outward from the burning wreck. For Tachsky, the moment did not feel like victory. It felt like exposure. The flash from the bazooka had turned the dark into daylight for an instant. That was all the Japanese needed. Machine gun fire snapped through the trees, cutting branches overhead. Mortar rounds followed, thudding into the slope with heavy hollow impacts. There was no time to debate, no time to count heads. Tachsky made the call. Split. Move. Disappear. Radios stayed silent. Hand signals vanished into darkness. For the next hour, the fight was not about firepower. It was about inches. A Japanese patrol passed within 10 feet of one team flashlight sweeping low. Leaves rustled. No one moved. Another team froze as voices stopped just beyond a tree line. Boots shifted. A match flared, then went out. At 9 p.m., Tachsky reached the rally point and began counting. 23. 17 missing. Standard doctrine allowed waiting 2 hours. The jungle did not. Enemy patrols were already closing in on the clearing. Staying meant being found. Tachsky made another decision that no manual covered. They would move back to Marine lines now, search for the missing men at first light. Leaving Marines behind went against everything he believed, but staying would cost the rest of them. The group moved cautiously through the dark, approaching friendly lines, where nervous sentries expected infiltration. Recognition signals cut through the night. 3 short whistles. Too long. Challenges came fast. Passwords answered. At 9:41 p.m., 23 men crossed back into Marine-held ground. 17 were still somewhere out there. The tank attack continued through the night. Sherman tanks fired point blank. Artillery walked shells across the darkness. By dawn, 27 of 37 Japanese tanks were destroyed or disabled. The breakthrough had failed, but the cost was written elsewhere. At first light on June 16th, Tachsky stood at the edge of the jungle again. This time, the mission was not reconnaissance. It was recovery, and what they would find would change the meaning of everything they had done the night before. When daylight returned on June 16th, the jungle told a different story than it had the night before. Burned-out tank hulks sat half-hidden among trees, their their tracks torn loose, armor split and blackened. Shell craters, overlapped shell craters, along the approaches to the gap between divisions. The Japanese tank attack had failed. Out of 37 tanks committed to the assault, 27 were destroyed or disabled by dawn. 11 were knocked out by American bazookas. 9 more were destroyed by Sherman tanks at close range. Artillery fire accounted for the rest. The line held. Barely. Marine losses were heavy. The 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines reported 78 casualties from the night fighting.